Hello, everybody who is in right now. If you are in this webinar, if somebody could let me know if there's any sort of echo or if you guys are hearing me all right, that would be fantastic. We're just going to wait one more minute for people to join, but also don't worry if um, you don't make it when we've started. This is actually being streamed to LinkedIn as well as to YouTube, and it will be available after this live as well so that you can go back to it at any point. A few things about the webinar today. You'll notice that the slides that I use are quite information heavy, and that's just so that people have kind of a better chance to follow along and to be able to read the things that I'm talking about as well, because I think we're going to be going through quite a bit. This is a follow-up to the webinar that I did last year. Great, thank you, Eamon. This is a follow-up to the webinar that I did last year during the first round of Northvolt layoffs to talk about what happens when people are going through layoffs. I have done some additions to this one to also go into bankruptcies because that is a fairly relevant topic right now. So to get started, basically, I'm going to go kind of through the work permit basics, layoff timeline, including what the timelines are looking like when it comes to bankruptcies and how that differs from standard terminations, and then what happens afterwards. So I'll be going through first-time work permit holders and how you proceed from there, extension holders, what other permit options that you have for each of these. And then I've also compiled a list of frequently asked questions to go through, and I've kind of separated those out in order to just make sure that those are addressed and you feel that those are addressed. And I did actually have some people send in questions ahead of time, or they talked to their colleagues and had them kind of compile questions as well. So I've added those as an additional FAQ afterwards as well. If people have any questions, please feel free to write during the webinar itself when it comes to mind. I may not be able to answer it at that moment, but I will address the questions that you have. If I feel that those are, too specific that I can't answer off the bat, or it's something that I think it's better not to go into at that moment, I will write it in the comments by tomorrow. So if you have questions and you put them into the comments, then if we don't get to address it verbally, we will write the answers to the questions as well. So you're welcome to write them as you go. So first things first, I'm sure you guys all know, but we're just going to go down to the basics because there may be people here that are newer to the Swedish work permit system. So a work permit is tied to a job position in a company for the first 24 months, and it's tied to a job position for the second 24 months. The main thing around work permits is that it relies on having a job that meets the requirements in order for you to qualify for maintaining that work permit as well. And this is specifically work permits for non-EU citizens, because EU citizens are a different thing, which I'll be going into later as well. When do you need to apply for a new work permit? So that's when you change a job or company during your first 24 months of a work permit. When you change job during your second work permit. So during your second permit, you're tied to a job position. You're allowed to change companies as long as that position doesn't change. But let's say internally inside of a company, if your job title changes, so if you're given a promotion or you're given additional responsibilities, or your job description changes, then you are required to submit a new work permit application, and as well when you lose your job and find a new one. But we'll go into the specifics of that. And you can lose your job and or work permit if you're laid off, if you resign, if you or your employer no longer fulfill the requirements, so the circumstances change around the work permit that was issued in the first place, or of course, when the company goes bankrupt. How layoffs typically work in Sweden is that a company announces that they'll be laying off part of their workforce and recommends employees to seek their unions for counsel. An investigation is made into whether employees can actually be transferred into other departments or try to find ways to maintain them within the organization. There's an obligation to negotiate. So if the company has a collective agreement, then the negotiation has to be with the union. If an employee is part of the union, they also need to negotiate with their union. Um, if the company has no collective agreement and the employee is not part of a union, then negotiation is not necessary. The employee is given termination notice, and the length of that termination notice is dependent on the employment agreement, although there is a potential to negotiate the length of time during the union as well. And then finally, there is the termination date, and the termination date is when kind of that countdown starts for you to find a new job in case of layoffs. In general, how bankruptcies work, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm not actually a bankruptcy expert, so I was doing additional research on this, is first and foremost, the company has to tries to take all measures to save the company. So this is one that what happened late last year then is that in the case of Northvolt, for example, they did different layoffs in order to try to cut down on their burn rate to save the company. Um, After kind of all measures are taken to save it, so in also their case, they tried to fundraise for it, then the company announces that they'll be filing for bankruptcy. The proceedings are supervised by the court, and an administrator is appointed as well. So in this case, a trustee has been appointed in order to try to navigate this bankruptcy. In Northvolt's case, the trustee is the one that they kind of put forward as the kind of requested appointee, and the court approved it. He's one of the most experienced trustees in the country, and he's navigated some enormous negotiations as well. So he's extremely competent, I would say. If the trustee finds a buyer, then there's negotiations that happen on the company structure. So obviously there's the options to buy a company as is, or you can, another company can come in for buy it for parts. But importantly, all employees will be made redundant even with a buyer. So when a company goes bankrupt, even if they get a buyer, effectively all employees have their contracts terminated. When the company is then purchased by a buyer, and depending on how it's set up, then employees may also be hired back as well, but you still need to go through processes for that. But that's just one thing to know, that even if there's a buyer, there's a chance that jobs may be saved in the sense of people may be hired back. But from a legal perspective, everybody has their employment's terminated. A few notes around bankruptcies as that employees are protected by a wage gap guarantee. So the sorry, I didn't write wage guarantee. So the wage guarantee is for notice period salary. And I believe right now the guarantee is up to 235,000 SEK per employee, but you need to submit the declaration for that as well. In terms of layoff timelines, if we're talking not about bankruptcy, because I'd like to go beyond just bankruptcy in this conversation, and also obviously include just layoffs as well, because I think that obviously there are people going through that. If you're at risk of being laid off, a few important things to know as the employee: don't sign anything right away. If you're part of a union and the union actually hasn't been brought in to negotiate then you should bring them in to negotiate. If you're not part of the union, and if the company doesn't have a collective agreement, there is no obligation to negotiate, but there is the potential to try to negotiate your terms as well. You may not be able to negotiate that, obviously, that you don't have your contract terminated, but what you can potentially try to do is negotiate the length of your notice period. So if you can buy yourself 1 month, 2 months extra on your notice period, then that just gives you more time then to try to line up another job as well. If, let's say, you have a 3-month notice period, and then depending on the length of your work permit, you have then a 3-month grace period afterwards. If you can negotiate 1 or 2 months extra of a notice period, then you're pushing your time to find a new job from 6 months to 7 or 8 months. So it can be beneficial. There's no obligation by the company to negotiate, especially if there are no unions involved um and the contract says a specific notice period, because most contracts will, but it can potentially be an option for you. Important thing is to not just sign something right away. A union can help you negotiate terms of employment, and they can help negotiate if the termination is lawful. What a union cannot do is advocate for you if you're not part of the union. So, in general, my loose recommendation in Sweden would be to join a union when you start employment. Um, you can always hope that you never have to use it, similar to insurance, um, but they can be quite useful in the worst case scenario as well. In terms of then what happens afterwards, um, the main misconception is that, you have the 3 months and then immediately your residence permit is revoked. So one thing is, a residence permit for work cannot be revoked before 3 months have passed since you lost your job, as long as your current permit is longer than that, according to the utlänningslagen. So the aliens law. The agency doesn't automatically revoke a permit after 3 months of unemployment. Your employer has to notify the agency that your employment has ended. The agency will communicate with you before revoking your permit, and they'll send you the date of revocation. Um, and you'll have a chance to give reasons why they should not revoke. So, for example, if you find new employment and line that up before your last date of employment, you'll get a letter from the agency saying, "Hey, you have your permit is going to be revoked. Is there a reason why we shouldn't revoke it?" And then you can submit your new information. When you apply for an extension, later, let's say you find a new job and you haven't lined up, the agency will take into consideration if you've had long periods of unemployment. In general, 3 months is not considered a long time. So I think the important thing in this one is, if you go through layoffs, not public layoffs or public bankruptcies like what's happening now, but for standard layoffs, typically what has to happen is that the employer notifies the agency that your employment has ended, and then you'll get notification from the agency regarding that. After a bankruptcy, even if the company has a new buyer, all employees will effectively have their contracts be terminated. The new company may choose to hire back employees on new contracts. Um, Honestly, I'm not really sure how the agency is going to track this, in terms of, I'm not sure if Northvolt will or has to notify Migrationsverket that your employment has ended, because there will be a specific assumption that anybody that has their work permits tied to Northvolt on, whatever official day of closure, it'll be assumed by the agency, obviously, that the circumstances have changed. So I'm not actually 100% sure on that, but either way, the agency should be sending you a letter notifying you that your permit will be revoked. You'll have a chance to give reasons why they should not revoke it, um, as well. So it's possible that Northvolt has to do the notification. It's also possible that the agency will also just know, because it's such a public um, bankruptcy, and this is one that's going through the courts as well. In terms of what happens afterwards, so there's actually different protocols for you if you lose your employment and you get a new job. There's different protocols surrounding if you're on your first work permit, so the first 24 months of your work permit, versus the second 24 months and after you've had an extension. So for the first work permit, you have 3 months from your last date of employment to find a new job and to submit a new work permit application. So this is really crucial. In the first 24 months, you must submit a new work permit application. You can't just notify the agency that you have new employment. The job, as always, needs to be advertised on Arbetsförmedlingen first. You have to fulfill the requirements for the work permit, and the company has to as well. So they have to provide the right insurances. Financially, they should be stable. On your end, you need to fulfill the salary requirement at that time. Right now, there's the national salary threshold of 28,480 SEK, but also you need to be at least above the 10th percentile of the salary for that job's SSYK code. So there's actually two numbers that you need to track for that. And then you need to have submitted your work permit application before the end of that 3-month grace period. They can be a bit flexible. So let's say that you start the application a week before that 3-month period. And so because of certain kind of holdups with the union, you don't get the application submitted, let's say, until like 2 days after that 3-month period is over. They can be like flexible with that when they see it as a whole. But it's important to hopefully have a new job lined up, let's say within 2.5 months of the last date of employment. If you have already had an extension and you're in the second 24 months of your work permit, you have 3 months as the same as the first work permit to find a new job. In this case, you just need to notify Migrationsverket and submit a new contract to them. Some people say you don't have to. I always recommend that you should, just to be on the safe side so that it's in their records. And usually if you submit that, then they'll confirm that you have that. The job must meet the requirements for the work permit, and you have to submit a new work permit application at the expiration or at the end of validity for your current permit as well. With the new company, some will say it doesn't have to be advertised, but I always recommend that the job position should be advertised. Is it currently 3 months no matter how long you've been in Sweden? I know it can feel super unfair when, you've been here for 3.5 years and have been compliantly on a work permit the whole time, and you only have 3 months to find a new job. Unfortunately, yes, currently it's 3 months, no matter how long you've been in Sweden. There is an EU directive, but that's not required until May 2026. So for now, proceed as if it's 3 months. One thing that's important as well is to talk about, do you always have 3 months? If you go to my LinkedIn, you'll actually see I made an infographic so you can figure out if you have 3 months, because it can be a bit confusing. But basically, do you always have 3 months? You do not have 3 months if your current permit expires in less than 3 months. So if your current permit expires in, let's say, 2 months, then you have until the end of your permit's validity to submit a new work permit application. Um, you do have 3 months if you've held a work permit for less than 6 months. However, you cannot, that's wrong. You can apply for a work permit from inside Sweden, but you're not allowed to work while you wait for a decision. So that part's where it gets gray. And then obviously then that can lead to problems if it takes a while for that new work permit to actually be issued. Then obviously you're without work for a while, and then there becomes the conversation about how long were you unemployed for, technically, when it comes to extensions or permanent residency applications further down the line. There can be exceptions made in this one, particularly for, I've heard of cases where somebody was on a student permit previously. They were on a job search visa afterwards, and then they got a work permit, they got a promotion, and had then they needed to submit a new work permit application at about the 5-month mark. And according to Migrationsverket, that was okay for them to start working because they had held multiple permits in Sweden prior. So there can be exceptions to this. There are no exceptions if you're on your first time in Sweden. It's a first time work permit. That's the first permit you've held, and you've held a permit for less than 6 months. So you've been on your permit for less than 6 months, but there can be exceptions. So it's always good to check with the Swedish Migration Agency about this. If you are still waiting on a decision, unfortunately, the agency doesn't consider you as being on a valid work permit. So you don't have the grace period. You essentially have until your termination date to submit new information. Or if you received your decision as a first-time work permit holder, but you have not yet entered Sweden to start your job, you don't have the option to then move to Sweden and have 3 months to actually then find a new job to replace it. If you have a valid work permit, you can apply for a spouse permit, doctoral studies, researcher permits from inside Sweden. You can apply for the highly qualified persons who want, like, looking for work or who want to start a business, but you actually have to wait outside Sweden for that decision. So in general, I get the question a lot in consultations of, okay, can I actually switch to a job seeking visa from my work permit? Technically, no. And even for studies, a lot of people think they can go back to university and apply for a student permit then. That's also not possible. The only student permits that you can actually apply for from inside Sweden from a work permit are doctoral studies, so PhD, and researchers. So you cannot apply for look for work after studies, highly qualified persons looking for work, or higher education permits from inside Sweden. One thing that I didn't actually list here is that you can apply for the self-employed permit from inside Sweden. However, the agency is very tough on issuing that. Last year, I believe there was 109 self-employed permits that were granted, and they do take specific things into consideration, including when you actually registered the company, your business plan, your financial projections, what your financial situation is looking like. You'll have to submit a full business plan. So a lot of people will approach the self-employed permit as a way to buy themselves more time until they find a job and can get then submit a new work permit application. I believe the agency is getting much tougher on those sorts of switching tracks, especially if they feel, based on your application, that it was just a way to buy you time. So if you're going to apply for a self-employed permit, then I highly recommend that you make it as comprehensive as possible and genuinely consider it as a business opportunity. The permit can succeed. I consulted on a case that had a successful self-employed permit application, but they also had a very strong business case, and they put a lot of effort into their business plan as well. So don't count on submitting part of the documents or an incomplete application, because the chance of them rejecting immediately is quite high, as well as if they feel that you've been switching back and forth in order to buy yourself more time, there may be problems with that as well. They are getting tougher on that because I believe they've had an increase in self-employed permit applications due to the many layoffs that are happening. In terms of FAQ, um, that most people have, obviously this is a long list. We're just going to go through it one by one. Before I continue further, though, is everybody okay? Does this make sense to everybody? Please let me know if I'm going too fast or if it's a bit confusing at the moment. I know that this is a lot of information that we're going through as well. But if we are good to move forward, then we will move forward. So, like I discussed, can I apply for a self-employed permit to buy myself more time? If you believe you have a viable self-employed business option, you could apply for it. However, the requirements are high with a high risk chance of rejection, and you will be rejected quickly if you clearly don't. So it is a risky one. My general recommendation for work permit holders is, in terms of best practices or trying to just protect yourself for the future, is I know it's additional work. I know you're very busy, but even starting to consider self-employed permit ideas um, during your time as an employed person, as kind of a just to give yourself more options, can be good. I have a question about getting a job as a remote freelance consultant. Um, It's possible. I don't believe that the agency discriminates between whether you have an LLC or a sole proprietorship. So a lot of people will get a sole proprietorship or an enhetsfirma. There are a few things though, is that it's important to actually base your company around at least some Swedish customers, because if it's all your customers are overseas, then the agency might ask, why do you actually have to be based in Sweden then? And that's not a good enough business case. They also prefer that you have multiple contracts going, so you shouldn't actually be just contracted out with one contract, because then the question will come, what if that job or that contract falls through? What's your backups for it? Um, you need to have a pretty comprehensive business plan regarding your sales, marketing, services, competitors. And it's also good if you don't already have an existing client list, then you should also get at least 2 to 3 letters of intent from potential clients before you submit your application. Furthermore, the question is coming up more and more about Swedish capabilities inside the organization. So it's also good if you can find ways to incorporate, if you don't speak Swedish yourself, incorporate a native Swedish speaker in some way, whether that's having them as kind of part-time for sales, or a Swedish accountant, or some level of Swedishness inside the company, as well as continue to work on your Swedish as well, because it is getting progressively tougher. But I think that it's important to try to um, emphasize why you should have some sort of base in Sweden. So I don't think it's impossible as a remote freelance consultant, but you'll need to take that, and also make sure to speak with an accountant or a financial advisor about how to take the sort of invoicing into account. How is that sort of thing going to work? Can I apply to go back to school from a valid work permit? You can go back to school for your PhD or a researcher from inside Sweden, as long as you apply before your work permit expires or your 3 months are up, but you cannot apply for higher education from inside Sweden. So you cannot go back to university from inside Sweden. I think this is quite a difficult one. I do know a lot of people that didn't finish their master's degrees because they got hired um, by companies on the assumption that if it doesn't work out, then they can go back to school to finish their thesis. But that's not possible to switch those permits. And I don't know if the government will make any sort of exception in this scenario. So that's another thing that I do emphasize as well, is that if those sort of opportunities come up, I do understand that there is an attraction um, to be getting paid a salary instead of paying tuition, but it can make it a lot more difficult if you don't actually get your degree, because in case of layoffs, you're not as competitive because you don't have the full degree. You don't qualify to apply for PhD programs or other programs that you can actually apply for from inside of Sweden. So I do suggest, when those sort of opportunities to come up, to actually do then a pro-con evaluation and think about what your long-term goals are before you make those sort of decisions. Do I have to get a job in the same position and industry to stay? So you can get a job in a different industry or position. The main thing this will affect is whether you need to apply for a new work permit, and your new job still needs to fulfill the work permit requirements, but there's nothing that's forcing you to actually stay within the same industry or within the same job position. My spouse has a permanent job now. Can they become the main applicant and I apply as a dependent? So your dependent cannot switch to the main applicant from inside Sweden. They don't allow for that change. So you'll need to leave Sweden and apply from outside. As the main applicant switching to the dependent, you can potentially make that switch from inside Sweden if the decision is made before your permit expires, but your partner will actually need to leave to become the main applicant. I got a new job, but my employer didn't advertise the position. Will this be a problem? Especially in the first 24 months? Yes, even if you're just changing companies but not positions, your employer should complete all requirements for a standard work permit, like advertising. I found a new job. Can I start working right away? So you can start working at your new job as long as you apply for a new work permit before your current one expires. And you can start working once your application or notification has been submitted to Migrationsverket. Like I said before, though, that's if you've held a work permit for more than 6 months. If you've held it for less than 6 months, you are not allowed to work while you wait for a decision. What if I find a new job during my notice period? Can I start working? You need to follow what's in your termination notice. Some termination notices may allow you to start working for a new company, while others may not. So that's something for you to discuss with your agency or with your company. One thing though is that you're not allowed to work two jobs at the same time. According to Migrationsverket, so people have gotten in trouble because they've worked like side jobs while they've had a main job. So if you find a new job during your notice period, then I recommend then that you terminate fully your existing contract so that there's no overlap. Because if you work two jobs at the same time, you're going to have problems when it comes to the extension, and you submit your pay slips, and then you may get your extensions rejected based on that. So you can start, if your work allows it, you can start working during your notice period, but you have to actually finish your employment before you start with the next one. But you may be able to negotiate with your company that you actually leave before your notice period is over. I found a new job, but it falls under the salary threshold. Will this work? So whether you're on a first-time work permit or an extension, any new job needs to fill the legal requirements for a work permit, including salary limits. So like I said earlier, that would be the national salary threshold of 28,480 in 2025. It's going to change in June, as well as above the 10th percentile of the jobs SSYK code. I'm waiting on my extension and I got laid off. Do I have 3 months? The 3-month period only applies if you're on a valid work permit. If you are waiting for a decision, you may search for a job during the processing time, but there's no guarantee. So please take that into account as well. Will being unemployed for a few months affect my extension options? So Migrationsverket will take your period of unemployment into consideration when making a decision for an extension, but they don't consider 3 months a long period of unemployment. So if you're unemployed for the entire grace period and then you manage to get a job and extend, then it shouldn't negatively impact you because they won't consider that too long. These are some questions that came in for this specific webinar. I realize that some of this is now going to be a little bit repetitive, but is it possible to go from main applicant to a dependent? Most of the time, the dependent cannot switch to the main applicant from inside Sweden. There may be exceptions due to this crisis. The government has said that they won't change the 3-month grace period, which obviously involves then redoing kind of the entire Aliens Act. But it's up for negotiation. There may be exceptions regarding switching from main applicant or from dependent to main applicant from inside Sweden, but that would be something to discuss directly with the Swedish Migration Agency, or also with your representatives, with the representatives of your organization, with any community providers that you may know. That's a larger discussion to have. What happens if I have a permanent residency application going? The way that permanent residency works, I don't want to call it a status, but it's a status that's added onto something. So you can't apply for permanent residency on its own. You apply for permanent residency together with an extension application. So if you still have to fulfill the requirements for the temporary extension in order to be eligible to be granted PR. So unfortunately, even if you have a PR application going, if you don't have a valid reason for a temporary extension, or you don't fulfill the requirements, then you cannot be granted permanent residency. Is an extension granted during a notice period? So if you're waiting for a decision on your work permit extension, and then you receive a termination notice and you have the notice period, an extension may be granted, as Migrationsverket isn't normally notified about the notice periods, just once the termination is complete. So it may be granted, especially for smaller companies that aren't publicly going through anything. I'm not 100% sure, There may be additional due diligence done because of the public nature of the bankruptcy that I'm not 100% sure how the agency is responding or treating the existing extension cases that are there right now. So I can't say for sure. I can say that, yes, of course, an extension can be granted during a notice period, but I'm not 100% sure what it's going to be like going forward in this specific case. Is there any other criteria that can override bankruptcy? So the specifics around this question, um, let me just pull it up. So in these situations, what are the criteria does Migrationsverket look at? So applicant's behavioral record, financial security, compliance with rules and regulations, or is bankruptcy the only criteria and it overrides everything else? So with work permits, the right to reside and stay in Sweden is on the basis of the work. So they will take the other things into consideration when it comes to granting permanent residency and citizenship, but when it comes to actually the ability to extend a permit, then the bankruptcy would be the overriding thing. Again, a buyer might come in, purchase the company, all the jobs might be saved, you might be employed again, and then that obviously changes things, but they won't take kind of behavior into consideration or positive behavior into consideration when talking about the eligibility of work permits as a whole. The Migrationsverket site says that work permits may still be approved for EU citizens if they can show sufficient funds. Can this consideration be extended to non-EU people as well? In this case, no. Sufficient funds apply to EU citizens to have a right to residence in Sweden. So to have a right to residence in Sweden as an EU citizen, somebody has to have a job, be self-employed, be in school, or have sufficient funds for which they need to submit all of their documentation. So they can be approved to stay in Sweden with sufficient funds because it's one of their the reasons to have the right to residence, but that does not apply to non-EU citizens. And what happens with a-kassa? So many employees have been paying diligently into a-kassa all through their employment, and now it's time to get some support from the funds while people continue to look for employment. But if the work permit ends sooner and doesn't allow for the 3-month grace period, then these social systems fail us totally. It seems like I've put my money into a system that I cannot get the benefit from when I need it the most because my work is not being extended. Yes. Unfortunately, you can take a-kassa while you have the right to reside in Sweden, but not beyond that. And I agree that it feels extremely unfair. And especially with how disruptive this all is, and I'm sure, it feels like the rug has been pulled out under you. There are a lot of social nets that exist here, but because they're wholly dependent on the right to reside, then it does feel like a lot of people fall through that net. Um, in terms of a-kassa and who is eligible for it, so you must have been a member for at least 12 months of a-kassa, and I think you have to have been working for at least 6. You have to work for more than 6 months at 40 hours per week, and then you need to submit and apply for it as well. So it is possible to get a-kassa during your search period at least, although I guess in a bankruptcy situation, you also have the wage guarantee as well. But I also understand the frustrations. So those were the main things that I was going through. I'm happy to publish again the infographic so that people can figure out fairly quickly whether they have 3 months or not, and I'll put that in the comments of this webinar as well. Does anybody have any questions? If you do, I'm available to answer any general questions that are posted in the comments, and then I will actually write out the answers in the comments after the webinar. I may not, especially because I don't know people's specific cases, then I can't answer specific questions. Um, or I may say I can write the answer later. But if it's very, very specific, I also don't want to talk out of turn as well. I'm just taking a look to see if anybody has questions. If not, I hope that that covers the majority of people's questions. Um, Feel free to post questions afterwards for those of you that weren't actually able to make it live. If you have kind of any follow-up questions, then you can post them in the comments as well. For this, we also have it available on our YouTube channel. If you have people in your community that are not active on LinkedIn, so Jeannie asked, do we need an immigration lawyer to appeal a decision? You don't need one, but I'd probably recommend one. One of the things regarding appeals is I think a lot of times people will make appeals based on, let's say, the emotional impact, the level of disruption, whether something is fair or not. But when it comes to appeals or legal aspects, it's not about the emotional aspects of it. It's about being able to argue legally. So um if you to get a better or a better chance of success regarding appeals, I do suggest going with an immigration lawyer because they can actually quote specific laws. They can, discuss cases that had similar outcomes. So they can take a more legal approach of it, which is generally what should be done in these cases. So I would probably suggest going with an immigration lawyer because the likelihood of you submitting an appeal and then having it then rejected and then having to submit an appeal again is high. Um, with regarding, I have a question as well around uh, a-kassa. And so you've been a member of a-kassa for 6 months and have held a work permit for more than 12 months. Are you entitled to a-kassa? I believe that you need to have you have to have been a member of a-kassa for at least 12 months in order to qualify. But let me just do a double check. On purpose. Um, but I believe it is, you had to have had it for 12 months. In order to apply for a permanent residence, does it have to be linked with a temporary permit application, or is it possible to submit a permanent residence application as a standalone? It's not possible to submit it as a standalone. It's typically something that you can add to a temporary extension. They'll ask, "Oh, do you wanna add permanent residency?" But you can't apply for permanent residency as a standalone. Are there any other questions? I see Francis, I had a question come in from YouTube, so there are people actually watching this on YouTube as well for people with specific questions around like unemployment, ALCASA, those sort of things. I'll also be including links in my responses in the comments just so that you can check those as well, because I am not an unemployment expert. So I think it's better to go directly to the source, but I will find those for you. All right. I'm gonna give it one more minute to see if anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, we're going to wrap this up. Uh, thank you to everyone who joined. I hope that this was somewhat helpful. A few things then I will put the infographic for figuring out if you have a 6 month, if you have a 3 month grace period into the comments. I will respond to the comments as well in writing tomorrow. And if you have any follow-up general questions, feel free to also put them in the comments. I will respond to them even if they're not asked within the time of this webinar as well. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining me after the workday. And if you guys have any other topics that you'd like us to cover in these webinars, I try to do a webinar once a month, and I try to find a topic that's relevant for you at this point in time, which is one of the reasons that we redid this one, as well as it was a request by Sajini. So if you have other questions, other areas you'd like us to tackle, then please leave those in the comments as well. Thanks everyone for being here. Have a good evening.